Hello and welcome. We're going to be talking today about transforming the relationship between DevOps and compliance teams. My name is Philip Miller and I'm a Principal Security Advisor within Amazon Web Services. The team that I'm a part of focuses on security assurance and compliance for companies across the world. Our focus is to try to help improve the relationships between DevOps, compliance teams, security risk and compliance officers, Chief Information Security Officers. And today we're going to be talking about how some of those experiences from building solutions with customers can be brought to your organization. Three things that we're going to be focusing on. First of all, we're going to be looking at data. What are the perspectives of data that you need to understand in order to more accurately deal with the undifferentiated heavy lifting that AWS does, along with the differentiated data that you're protecting for your organization? We're going to be discussing some of the conflicts that occur between compliance and innovation, and how both development teams, builder teams, security teams, compliance teams, and risk teams can collaborate to improve upon some of those natural tendencies that occur. And we're going to do that through exploring 6 specific mechanisms, reliable patterns that you can use. So let's talk about data first. So we have 2 ways of thinking about data that matter when you're looking at security, risk, and compliance. The first is sensitive data. What do we mean by sensitive data? Well, that is your information that your company needs to protect, not because somebody else is telling you to protect it, but because it's the thing that you need to do in order to drive your business forward. The things that are important for your customers, the promises that you've made to your stakeholders. It could be information that is incredibly sensitive, such as merger and acquisition details. It could be customer segment information, things that would be damaging if a competitor was to get a hold of it. That information you're going to protect no matter what somebody tells you to do, because you know it's the right thing for your business objectives. Those are the things that you need to grow your business. And for those things, you've selected Amazon Web Services as a partner in doing that. And for whatever reason you might have in your portfolio, you're going to find new ways to use that data, ways to innovate within the cloud. And we want to make sure that as you're protecting that information, that you have the best means, best mechanisms to do so. But at the same time, you have potentially regulated data. This is data that whether you choose to secure it or not, you have an obligation to some external entity, a reason that you must secure that data, coupled with potentially mechanisms that you must follow to secure that data. And for those things, we have a shared responsibility. You may find information, for example, in AWS Artifact about how we protect underlying services, while you have a responsibility to make sure that you're using all of the principles explained in the well-architected framework to store and use that data protection layer. When you're presenting information externally to audit teams, to compliance teams, to those that are assessing the risk, those are the things that fall into the realm of regulated data. And it's those that we find most often create challenges for organizations because of a number of items, particularly that we have delays in cloud awareness of the new technology, the methods in which cloud storage, cloud computing relate to the ways in which data used to be stored and processed and transmitted prior to the cloud. And what we find is that if organizations haven't taken a serious and considered approach to updating their mechanisms for evaluating whether they're meeting a compliance requirement, when it comes time to that proverbial go live, there is a moment where people say, I don't have what I need in order to prove that I'm compliant. And manual verification is a big component of that. A lot of the compliance frameworks that exist in the marketplace that people have to adhere to were built up from an experience that something negative, something bad to an organization occurred, and they try to come up with a control mechanism, a statement that if you do this, we hope that you won't have a problem. And so when we're looking at those manual verification steps, they often don't update and translate very well into a cloud computing environment. Couple that with documentation. Documentation around compliance is in a foreign language to many people, right? If you're a builder team and your focus is on writing code, running services, perhaps you're using serverless computing, and you have these compliance requirements that are written in some sort of quasi-legalese, you might be scratching your head and say, I just don't understand how this applies to me or my particular situation. And so compliance officers are very, very good and very experienced at translating some of that terminology, but they may not have updated their skills or be as aware of what is available in the cloud. So we have this dichotomy of compliance frameworks slow to update and individuals not necessarily all being brought up to speed in terms of what the cloud brings at the same time. Then you have inconsistencies, lots of inconsistencies. These have come across over time, partly because executive leaders, and I've been in that position myself of having to make the decisions, the trade-offs between what is perfect and what is an acceptable risk for an organization. And when you're looking at those, you are doing the best thing you can for your organization, your stakeholders, and making sure that you meet those privacy and compliance organization necessary objectives, but it may not look the same to a builder team. And so as we think about how do you explain that over time when you may have a risk register, a listing of concerns and risks that are spread up over time, and you're looking at it as a builder and say, but hang on a second, you approved me using this particular encryption level 2 years ago, and I don't understand why it's not good enough today, even though the old system is still in production. So we have to try to evaluate, if we're governing by exception, how do we move beyond that? And we believe that there are a number of mechanisms that can loosely be described as a security framework or a security assurance framework, that if you adopt these holistically within your organization, that you start to pull down from this list of concerns, of issues, and your organization starts to get into a repeatable wash, rinse, repeat cycle where I won't say that harmony comes naturally, but that a level of push-pull does get reduced, because now you have not just a common language, but you have a common framework and a set of shared objectives that are translatable across both security, compliance, risk, and builder teams. So what do those look like? The first one I'd like to talk about is, at the heart of everything from a compliance perspective, sit these ideas of controls. Controls are, if you think about some of the things in the natural world that we live in that control, a light switch is a very simple kind of control, right? You flip it on, the light comes on, turned off, you know what happens, hopefully every single time. But if you're building a complex environment with lots of switches, maybe you've got electronic switches such as relays, there's a need to test those. In the engineering world, manufacturing, we call that like preventive maintenance. So we want to make sure that we have controls in place that will help us ensure that something is working in the way that it should be working. And within the context of cloud, there are 3 things that you can do to make code more effective from the perspective of proving that you have adhered to some of these control requirements. The first one is around, how do you extract that evidence? How do you prove out in a way that is 100% verifiable, 100% repeatable, that the control is being met. And so we think about writing code to extract that information, making sure that that code isn't just something that needs to be run once a year, but it's something that can be run on a regular basis, potentially trying to move into the world of continuous compliance. And some of this may be delivered through things that both check configuration as well as things that check running state. But it's also important to remember to look at outcomes, right? So you may have data that is stored in an S3 bucket, and that data is not the right data for the classification that you intend for that S3 bucket. And so you need to have ways, mechanisms that both take the policy aspect, which we would encourage you to think about writing policy statements as code too, so that you can evaluate them with scripts. And part of the way in which we think about doing that is using AWS services that have built-in capabilities, such as AWS Security Hub, that builds upon well-architected and builds upon and aligns to a consistent security framework for your organization, a framework that understands what your risk posture is and understands and is able to respond to particular needs for particular applications. So in the world of compliance, a lot of companies use a governance, risk, and compliance tool. And tools like AWS Security Hub can interface with those tools and enable you to extract evidence of a control that is in compliant with a particular framework and deliver that in a consistent format for consumption elsewhere. So whether you're thinking about starting from the very beginning, or if you're a mature company that's been using a GRC tool for a long time, would encourage you to think about these three principles, making sure that as much as you can, you've automated the control extraction, that you're comparing it against code that is describing the policy that has to be adhered to, and using our prescriptive guidance in Well Architected as a foundation for the core services that you're using, and then modeled the other configuration elements that you need upon those same principles, perhaps those that are described as the AWS security epics. But once you've got that foundation in place, what do you do next? How do you transform and get that agility that you're looking for? Well, that comes from a combination of both scale and automation. So if we think about the stock market, right? When does the stock market seem to move in cohesion with the rest of the world? And it moves when it sees that there's a predictable outcome for a series of events. Stock market hates irregularity. And when we think about compliance, when we think about building products at scale, we want to get to that same level of predictability, where a builder team can look at a series of AWS services, a series of code that they're about to implement, and know that that will get confirmed by the teams that run security, by the teams that evaluate risk, and ultimately by any systems that are going to prove compliance. And we want to do that. We want to use those mechanisms that we already know from systems architecture, the reference models, the patterns, and find ways to approve those ahead of time. So if we can create reliable patterns, and I would recommend that if you're thinking about doing this, like where do you start? Think about data protection, right? Because at the heart of everything you do, your organization is going to have data. And if you can find ways to automate and then govern at scale the data, it becomes a lot easier to think about the other layers, the compute layers, the network transport layers, and so on. So, here's an example here of how you might tie together a number of AWS services together in order to create that end-to-end view, visualized in QuickSight, for example, whether or not you have the right data in a particular S3 bucket, and that data evaluation is done by Amazon Macie, and it is processed and compared through a compliance at code type engine that you might build either in Lambda or some other set of technology. But every time you build a pattern, every time you exercise that pattern, every time you update that pattern, you can reevaluate whether it meets the risk and compliance posture of the company. And then you don't have to go every single time when you're preparing for launch and wonder, is this thing that I'm building going to be acceptable to the organization? And if we can get there from a scale and automation perspective, we can now start moving into this concept of secure design. So reference models are often thought to be very big and complicated, but in the best models that I've seen, they're the smallest building blocks that you can use. So if you can create small building blocks, for example, this is showing a building block for some account management technology services built upon AWS organizations. But if you think about it in terms of like a minimum deployable unit for a reference model, and you build up as many of these and identify where reference models can be used in conjunction with other reference models, now you start building in that sort of provable security layer for your organization. And we want to get to that point where it isn't a sense of, I need to check whether the data that's flowing through my system is compliant, but it is impossible for the data that flows through my system not to be compliant, because the manner in which the data is stored in the system has to be, by its definition of that system, compliant from the word get-go. So for example, if you're building your solutions from code, for example in CloudFormation, and then you are validating your CloudFormation templates meet a set of objective security requirements, have been validated by your teams that are looking both at risk, security, and compliance. Now, every time you exercise that script, you can do so with the confidence that you're doing it in the way that everybody who's a stakeholder in protecting that data can feel comfortable with. And so the scripting generates accuracy. The reference models provide a common repository, common language for builder teams and security teams to talk about some of the risks, some of the challenges that come to bear. And it also gives you a means or a mechanism for when new AWS services are released to start incorporating those through a non-production environment, because now you can look back at existing reference models and say, where does this particular AWS service fit into those reference models? So it's really important when you're thinking about this in terms of provable security to look not just at the output that comes at the end, but look at both the input mechanisms. Am I checking to make sure that the data that I'm going to accept into my reference model is good data at the beginning? And am I making sure that all the places that I store that data and transform that data before I get to output, are those things also in alignment with the risk posture of the organization? So I've been talking a lot about risk. And that is because compliance and risk and security are inextricably linked with one another. But oftentimes we have in organizations looked at risk from a very broad lens. And that has been fine, particularly in a singular risk model. By singular risk model, I mean you as an entity have accepted all of the risk for your storage and compute because it's been sitting within your own data center. But as you move into worlds where you're sharing that responsibility with AWS, maybe you're sharing it with partners and suppliers too, you have to get to a mindset where you're quantifying that risk at a much more granular level. And at the end of the day, there's really sort of two areas that we want to pull together. We want to be able to identify the probable loss magnitude. So how big of a loss or harm to the organization would it be if something negative was to happen? And how likely or how frequently could that event happen to our organization? And you can use tables like this example that I have on the screen to ascertain what response might you have? What level of complexity are you willing to bring to your organization in order to avoid or limit the risk should it occur? And in addition to that sort of quantifiable step, and there are many models out there that you can find that are reliable and trustworthy for getting into this risk quantification business, but it's important to think not only in terms of what will happen if something occurs, but also to think about what can happen if something doesn't happen. What is the impact of continuing to use technology in a certain way? What is the impact to the business of losing that opportunity for a merger or acquisition because your cloud team and your compliance team are not ready to accept a particular workload or service into their organization's footprint on AWS? And then you mustn't forget about the people perspective, right? It's easy for those of us that sit in the world of technology to think about everything in terms of bits and bytes. But it is the people dimension that often creates the biggest opportunity to address and solve some of the risk parts of your operation. And by that, it's bringing people together to find new ways collaboratively to solve some of these issues that have been occurring in your organization for a long time. And it may not be intuitively obvious to any one of you, but when you start having those conversations with the risk teams, the compliance teams, the security teams, and the builder teams, there's a chance, a very high chance, that you'll find a lot of commonality of issues that can be resolved together. And that's where alignment really comes to bear. This is an interesting graphic because at first glance it seems to depict that which every organization is aspiring to. There's a big goal. In this case, they're cleaning up this new invention, a light bulb. And everybody's working together to make this happen. Everybody's busy, everybody's engaged, until you look a little deeper at the picture. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the individual who's probably responsible for compliance. They have the checklist, and they're making sure that things are being done. And then, of course, there's the boss up on the ladder, barking out the orders for everybody to follow. But down below, if you look really closely at the guy on the ladder with the little cloth in his hands, he has the power cord for the light bulb wrapped around his ladder. It is a disaster waiting to happen. And then there's the little guy in the front foreground with his little switch, his control, and he's kind of scratching his head and saying, I don't know, I'm being told to turn it on, but maybe that doesn't seem like such a good idea. And I think all of us that have been both on builder teams and security teams never forget that time when we were trying to launch something really important for our business stakeholders. We had all the sign-off that we thought was necessary, and then somebody in security says, well, hold on a second, there's a problem. Or if you're on the compliance side, when you've identified that there's a risk, when you've identified there's a trap that needs to be avoided, and you're told by the senior leadership that you have to figure out a way to accept that risk, modify that risk, cover that risk, because the business need must be resolved within a particular framework of time that's immovable. And so if we don't spend enough time, enough energy identifying all of the risks, all of the problems that could occur, and make sure that we're aligned as a business before we start embarking on an important endeavor, then we run the very real risk that our organization won't get that force multiplication effect of the cloud. So this is sort of, my call to action, my warning slide is that you really should be finding new ways to bring these compliance principles to bear as early on in your dev cycle as you possibly can. And as development and builder teams, thinking about how can you automate the process, how can you connect the DevOps world and the security ops world and the risk ops world and compliance together so that you are building this level of business alignment in cohesion with one another, as opposed to just sort of waiting for the next order to be marked, waiting for the next item to be checked off the list. And part of the way you can do this is with the final mechanism. This is a concept that I call domain charters. And a domain can be as broad as the entire cloud security domain, for example, or it could be much more narrow. It could be the digital business domain. It could be the software development domain. But within each domain, if you develop charters, written documents that describe the way in which team members will collaborate with one another, and they become the foundational guardrails, the ways in which people know if I make a decision within these particular lanes, that those decisions will provide the assurance back to our stakeholders, back to the executive leadership, that what I am doing is in alignment with the business outcomes that are sought, with the risk appetite that the company has agreed to, and is using the technology in a responsible way, and is aligned to the cost structures that the company has agreed to bear. So these domain charters have a great and important foundational aspect for collaboration, but they also set the tone for how much and how fast you might choose to adopt particular services. And here's a couple of examples from real domain charters that have been produced by AWS customers. This first one in particular, I think, speaks heavily to the concepts that we're trying to be a part of with our customer journey. And that is, yes, we want our customers to lean into cloud native technology, not just for building solutions, but also for solving the security problems. But we also believe there's an inherent value in a flywheel process, connecting things that occur in the audit community, from the risk community, from the compliance community, back into the work that the developers do, and from them back into the world of SRC, security, risk, and compliance. And some ways in which that can happen are through the use of embedding technology and embedding teams together with particular skill sets on projects. So this organization that picked this second domain charter example, what they were trying to do was incorporate some gamification elements and some real life simulation exercises, such as the AWS Security Jam program that we use, to change the way in which individuals thought about the activities that needed to be performed, because they wanted to make sure that not everything happened in the context of a project or a deliverable. They wanted to make sure that there was some level of exploration and discovery happening, and doing it in a way that was low risk to the actual enterprise. So as you think about your organization, as you think about how can we become more aligned as a business, if you think about the risks that you face and the controls that are within your purview as a team member, whether you're the executive who's trying to set the tone and tenor, or if you're the builder team member that is trying to secure workloads on EC2, understand how can I use some of these principles to further advance the mission of our organization. Or if you want to think very big, very broad, think about that overall idea of a security assurance framework or a security framework. How can I change all of the things that happen naturally within the organization from a compliance, but bring those together, orchestrate them together in a meaningful way? And so hopefully these ideas and themes have given you some food for thought, and we're happy and excited to continue to have that discussion with you, both in person and online. So thank you for your attention today. I really appreciate it. And as always, we greatly appreciate it when you participate with us in this journey and share your feedback with us through the session survey process. Wish you all a very safe and happy rest of 2020. Thank you.